Deconstructing Common Life, Part 5, starting with Section 11. The PD may argue that PD thinks a person's common life is influenced by their homeland, that humans' common life is part of PD identity, and that I have laid out a false contrast. Perhaps I have, and certainly I don't mean to say Hume and Derrida cannot overlap at all. Also, it's to be noted here that this paper is not drawing into question the need for exploring and understanding topics of race, sex, and gender. Blackness Visible, for example, by Charles W. Mills, is a book I believe everyone should read. The question here is only if PD identity is as robust as Hume's common life and vice versa, and if neoliberalism has removed the possibility of either being as robust as needed to address the incompleteness of rationality and fight against totalitarianism. Personally, I don't know if the two are equally as strong, but I do think it's fair to say that it seems easier to say what's not being white, not being homosexual, etc. means versus saying what is whiteness, heterosexual, and so forth. It's easier to say what whiteness isn't versus what it is. On the other hand, though not necessarily easy, it seems easier to say what it means positively to be a farmer in Bedford without the risk of being offensive or exclusionary. If I said, she's from Italy, so she probably likes ravioli, though perhaps somewhat stereotypical, I don't believe it's nearly as offensive as saying, she's black, so she likes fried chicken. If someone told me she was from New Orleans, it wouldn't be considered as wrong for me to ask if the person was thus familiar with Café du Monde. But if I met someone who was black and asked if she liked hip-hop based simply on her skin color, I would act assumptive and arguably racist. If I saw someone wearing a shirt for a computer science company and I asked if she used C++, I would just be making conversation. If I saw someone who was black and asked if she thought Obama was a good president, I would possibly cause offense. Why is it that assuming X or Y regarding homeland seems more permissible than assuming W or Z regarding race? This seems to be an important question. Perhaps it's because a city like New Orleans necessarily entails a certain landscape and particularity manifest by the geography itself, while blackness does not necessarily entail any certain manifestation of itself at all beyond black skin relative to what people define as black. Yes, black skin necessarily entails a denial of social privilege, connection with an oppressed history, and so on, but these necessities are very general, and it must be determined what they mean for each individual by each individual. How particularly a given black person has been oppressed can vary between individuals. One may have suffered police brutality, another unfair rejection from a job interview, and another both. Oppression manifests in many ways, as does black culture, black interest, and so on. But Café du Monde manifests only in one way, and New Orleans culture is much more limited in its manifestations, though that's not to say there's no diversity at all. Yes, what Café du Monde means to people can vary, as can the culture of New Orleans, but the physical fact of Café du Monde does not vary, as don't dramatically vary the physical facts of the kinds of food and music found in the area. The variation comes from what the facts of the geography mean, while in blackness the variation comes from both what constitutes black facts and from what those black facts mean. For geography, there is seemingly one level of abstraction. For race, at least two. The more levels of abstraction there are, the less definite the sources of identity, which, though may increase individual freedom and expression, would reduce the possibility of those sources providing robust grounding and definition that could combat existential anxiety and uncertainty, increasing the appeal of totalitarianism, assuming belonging, again, is correct. If you live in New Orleans, it is a physical fact, radically particular, that Café du Monde is nearby, that the same violinist plays there every Wednesday afternoon, that two kittens like to sleep against the cafe wall facing the Mississippi, and so on. There is nothing to be determined or defined. Café du Monde is there. Yes, a person from New Orleans may claim that what it means for her to be from New Orleans has nothing to do with Café du Monde, but the physical fact of the cafe would remain in her world, and for a person to associate New Orleans with a cafe would not be unreasonable. On the other hand, to automatically associate a white man with bad dancing would be offensive because there is no necessary reason why the physical fact of white skin would be linked up with the physical fact of bad dancing. The connection is not part of the land, per se. Perhaps it is predictable a person would ask someone from New Orleans about Café du Monde, but it's certainly not unquestionably oppressive, bigoted, or ignorant. A location like New Orleans entails a radical diversity of facts of which cannot be debated in their facticity, while a race like blackness entails the important fact of black skin color, and though there is a vast diversity of views on what that skin color means, the debate is about the meaning and implications of skin color. The facticity of blackness itself is much more limited. This isn't to say that the history of oppression isn't a collection of facts, that racism isn't a fact, and so on, but rather to say that the facticity of blackness itself is mostly limited to black skin, while the facticity of a location is vaster. There are rivers, shops, mountains, farms, all in Bedford, Virginia, and so there is space in the facticity of Bedford to ground different kinds of people. However, there is practically only skin color in the facticity of biological race, at least as experienced phenomenologically by outsiders. As there is practically only testosterone and or estrogen in gender, this isn't to say as there is practically only such. This isn't to say race, sex, and gender are merely biological facts, nor do I mean to say that black skin doesn't lead to countless facts in society. Rather, I am saying that race in itself entails limited facticity, and the key point is that the more an identity is grounded in facticity, the stronger that identity will be at providing an individual with a firm sense of identity and existential stability, and the better that identity will be at addressing the problem of incomplete rationality. The same logic applies to Hume's common life. At the same time, the more an identity is grounded in facticity, the more it will be limiting of individuality, a possible source of oppression, and married to the chance of causing the banality of evil, as discussed in Belonging Again. Thus, if we maintain the division between PD identity and Hume's common life, PD identity might be less able to stop bad philosophy, but Hume's common life might be less capable of stopping Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. The facticity of common life itself is more diverse than PD identity, while there is more diversity for individual expression in PD identity. Ironically, diverse facticity gives way to less diverse individual expression, while limited facticity gives way to more diverse individual expression. There are far more facts that compose the geography of a locality, and the variation of those facts give rise to much more diversity in what the geography means for people without the concreteness of that geography being lost. As the meaning of social constructs are debated, though, the facticity of those social constructs are increasingly thrown into question, potentially adding layers of abstraction upon layers of abstraction. Also, in discussions on race, black skin is primarily a signifier of a history of oppression and so on, while New Orleans is more so Café du Monde, the Mississippi, and so on. Yes, it could be argued that New Orleans is technically a signifier, as it could be argued about everything, but at least it should be said that PD identity and the meaning of blackness is more signifier-based than New Orleans. This is because blackness is practically a single fact, skin color, and then mostly the oppressive social constructs that form around that skin color, while geography is less the social construct formed around that geography. New Orleans, a festival spot, so on, and mostly the multitude of facts that define that geography. In other words, race is more a social construct than that each individual must understand for themselves than is a location, and thus the identity formed around race is more based on a social construct than the communal identity formed around a location. The same logic applies to sex and gender. In being centered on a social construct, a race-based identity is able to make more space for individual expression precisely in recognizing the artificiality of the social construct, while a location-based identity in being centered on facticity is less able to make space for individual expression in being unable to recognize its center as constructed. Yes, the individuality a location gives rise to will be more robust in being mostly based on facticity, but paradoxically, even if there is more diversity in the facticity of a place, there will be less diverse individuals. The individuality, race, gender, and sex, the individual race, sex, and gender give rise to will be more fragile in being based mostly on social constructs, but paradoxically, in there being less diversity in the facticity of PD identity, there will also be more diverse individuals. But I might need to be more careful in my language. Between common life and PD identity, how individual formation occurs is different still. A given geography doesn't actively shape people. Rather, people are shaped by the space between them and the land. The identity emerges in response to facticity, the need to cut hay, to build houses that can withstand flooding, playing around the Mississippi, so on. The hay itself doesn't mold people with hands like a potter does clay. The identity forms gradually through response to the land and the resulting action. The residents don't stop what they are doing one day, think about themselves, and decide who they are. It's much more emergent. The identity is emergent. Is PD identity planned and consciously selected? More so, yes, since it is more abstract and being more so a social construct. It entails more abstract reasoning and conscious ownership, especially when trying to decide what blackness is versus what blackness is not. The black person is forced to respond to racism like the farmer in Bedford is forced to respond to the community he or she is thrown into, and so there is certainly an emergent dimension to PD identity. But the Bedford farmer's positive identity is naturally emergent, while the PD must consciously and abstractly discern a positive identity, which seems impossible considering the necessary incompleteness of rationality. That said, if the Bedford farmer engages in no philosophy and doesn't understand his or her positive identity is emergent and ultimately unphilosophical, in line with the arguments of Hume and this paper, that positive identity will be just as fragile as the PD identity, and in fact could be weaker than a PD identity that accepts its unrational foundation. There are certainly emergent dimensions of PD identity, but while the person who is a farmer responds directly to the land that forms the farmer, the minority mostly responds to responses to his or her black skin. They must deal with racism, for example. The emergent dimensions of PD identity are formed by responses to facts, while the emergent dimensions of common life are formed by responses to facts. There is an extra layer of abstraction in PD and or metamentality, to use a term from O.G. Rose. And because of that additional layer, the emergent dimensions of PD identity feel more forced upon individuals, less selected, and less robust. And in feeling more externally sourced versus internally beget, the dimensions can feel more alienating. Additionally, if racism were to end, for example, there would cease being responses to minority facticity to which minorities would have to respond and emergently formulate themselves. PD identity can require others like common life requires geography, but much more easily than geography individuals can change. Lastly, it was unnecessary for white people to oppress black people. They chose to commit that evil, while geography made it necessary for people who lived in New Orleans to adapt to the fact of the Mississippi River. No, the earth didn't have to form in a manner that forced the river to be there. But once there, it was a physical fact, as it is now a fact that white people oppress black people. Consequently, PD identities can feel more arbitrary and reactive than substantive and self-directed, and it is precisely the unnecessariness of identities forced into being by oppression that can worsen any torment they may cause. Section 12. A chart may prove helpful. So we can associate unphilosophical common life with the second most robust identity, but it's also the most likely to cause the banality of evil. Second, we have the philosophical common life, which is the most robust, but it is also the second most likely to fall into the banality of evil. We have the unphilosophical PD identity, which is the least robust, but it's the third most likely to fall into the banality of evil. And then we have philosophical PD identity, third most robust, and least likely to fall in the banality of evil. So as we can see, each mode has advantages and disadvantages. Strangely, emergent identity is firm, while consciously and rationally chosen identity is more fragile, and yet firm identity that is not consciously and rationally acknowledged also suffers from fragility. Those whose identity arises from common life but aren't philosophically trained will have robust identities that will not be able to explain or convincingly defer to an unrational truth, and thus won't be as robust as they could be. But on the positive side, they won't be as susceptible to the banality of evil either. It was discussed earlier that if givens work, the banality of evil is more likely. But if there are no givens, there is existential anxiety in which totalitarianism becomes appealing. The question we must ask is if a philosophical common lifer is really less likely to fall into the banality of evil, for it's conceivable that someone philosophically skilled would be more able to rationalize the banality of evil from within a common life. But Hume would argue this person is not actually a good philosopher, for though the person looks like he or she defers to common life, the individual only goes through the motions of a common life and ultimately uses common life for the ends of bad philosophy. Perhaps this is what makes the banality of evil so terrible. It looks like good philosophy, but is ultimately for the ends of bad philosophy. It looks like a deferral to common life, but ultimately uses common life as a means to a bad end. Considering this, the banality of evil is a form of bad philosophy in which the logic of common life is used to justify activity beyond a common life that resembles that common life. If X is the common life of Bedford, the banality of evil can occur both when X isolates itself as an objective good beyond criticism and or when the people of Bedford try to explain and totalize X beyond Bedford into the rest of Virginia, perhaps by force. The people of Bedford, in this example, are trying to expand their common life to consume and replace all common lives. And as this occurs, perhaps the people of Bedford justify this activity on unrational grounds, while also wanting everyone in the world to share their unrational foundation, so that everyone's incomplete rationality is similarly founded. But why is this an example of bad philosophy and not a problematic possibility within good philosophy? Hume might say that this is because the individual who forces his or her unrationality on others is a person who is necessarily more certain about it than any good philosophy could ever be. Force is necessarily an act of certainty, which, even if done in the name of Humean tradition, automatically makes the activity fall outside the Humean tradition. All right, but is the Humean philosopher allowed to try to persuade others that a given common life is better than another common life? If Christians attempt to convert others to Christianity, for example, is this an example of bad philosophy or theology, or an expression of a person's common life, seeing as evangelicism is a deep and a essential part of Christianity, ergo the effort to spread Christianity? It depends. In the eyes of the Humean skeptic, the Christian who tries to convert others to Christianity through practicing his or her common life, for example, is not a person who engages in bad philosophy, but the person argues on grounds of living out natural beliefs for the sake of changing natural beliefs. They show instead of tell, per se. The persuasion is not philosophical at all, but lived. Where Hume would have had issue is when the Christian engages in apologetics, especially if that apologetics is not used to invite a person to witness and participate in a common life, as if apologetics can offer a complete case, which is to suggest that autonomous rationality and or autonomous theology is possible. Perhaps the distinction needs to be drawn between good apologetics and bad apologetics, like Hume's good philosophy and bad philosophy, as I am increasingly convinced is needed in every field, sociology, economics, and so on. Similarly, Americans, compelled by what they believe is the greatness of their country to spread their socio-political beliefs, ideas on human rights, and so on, would not fall into the banality of evil if the Americans only tried to persuade others to willingly participate in American unrationality. For in the act of persuasion, there is a necessary level of epistemic humility. If I believe I must persuade you to believe X, then I don't believe X justifies me to do anything necessary to make you believe X. But if I was entirely sure X was true, then that fact alone would justify me acting in extraordinary ways to make others believe. Even if I strongly believe the main ideas of X, if I believe I am not justified to force others to believe in X, then at the very least I must practically assent to uncertainty about the details of X, and that leans me toward good philosophy. If Americans used force, even if the people doing the forcing mentally believed they were epistemically humble and that it was possible that they were wrong, practically they would be engaging in certainty and thus bad philosophy. And as we learn from Hume, what a person practically does is ultimately what decides the meaning and type of their philosophy. For the mind is an endless source of self-deception, rationalization, and so on. Once individuals move from persuasion to force, even if in the name of good philosophy they have moved into bad philosophy, for to use force necessarily means people are more certain of their system than justified. Democracy is supposed to be a free space in which citizens can persuade others of their views. But if I force others to be democratic, it's as if I force everyone to be a Humean skeptic who defers to common life. In the name of good philosophy, I act like a bad philosopher. If bad philosophy is engaged in, even for the ends of good philosophy, I fail to be a good philosopher. The means negate the end. All this suggests what seems to usually happen with the banality of evil, and why I think it's fair to argue that the philosophical common life is less likely to fall into the banality of evil than the unphilosophical common lifer, especially considering that I mean good philosophy in this context, what I mean by good philosophy in this context. But when the banality of evil occurs, the person practically moves outside good philosophy, even while he or she mentally assents to good philosophy. Which, if the person was well-versed in human thought, the person would not allow. The banality of evil is an example of when, in the name of good philosophy, bad philosophy is justified, where, in hopes of returning to the world of common life is destroyed. Can there be force within a common life that does not try to force other common lifers to conform to it? Can a common life that is externally good be internally bad? If members of the common life force locals to live according to the common life, then indeed good philosophy is not practiced, for clearly these internal members of the common life ignored the philosophical journey, for if they hadn't, they wouldn't be so certain of themselves that they were willing to engage in force. What about the Foucaultian soft force that standards of normality can cause oppressing people? Is there bad philosophy wherever there is normality? At this point, we would be arguing that any restriction on the individual was an example of force and thus bad philosophy. But if there were no givens at all, there would be anarchy and existential chaos. In a sense, soft force is a kind of force, but it's an inevitable dimension of any social structure. The question is if members of a common life are self-righteous, oppressive, and overly certain about their givens, as opposed to being toward them with a tragic sense of necessity, epistemic humility, and understanding that the incomplete nature of rationality requires givens. Soft force can be weakened, though not entirely eliminated, without causing anarchy, if everyone in a common life is a good philosopher. Weaker soft force may not be enough in the eyes of minorities, but the only way to eliminate soft force entirely is to eradicate givens and so make totalitarianism appealing and likely. At the same time, though, common life can entail oppression, and the critiques of postmodern deconstruction can prove useful for correcting that injustice. American common life has incubated and spread racism, and the work of Derrida can prove useful for stopping that from happening again. But is PD criticism as effective as Humean skepticism? And even if it is it worth the additional risk of eradicating instead of refining givens? Certainly PD criticism is better than nothing, but is it better than Humean skepticism? Do we need both or just the superior one, a mixture? Section 13. Which is ultimately better at bringing people together and addressing the incompleteness of rationality, Hume's common life or PD identity? In a world shaped by neoliberalism and global capitalism, perhaps neither are as capable as they once were, but a simple question might help us guess. Is a white man in Bedford more like a black man in Bedford than a white man in Bedford is like a white man in Washington, D.C.? This is a general question, and it doesn't follow that every black person in Bedford is more like every white person in Bedford than a given black individual in Washington. However, what the question is getting at is if where a person is born and lives has more influence on the formation of the individual than their race, sex, or gender. Are white people in America more like white people in Europe than other black Americans? Certainly, humans are all shaped by all dimensions of reality, location, culture, race, sex, and so forth. But what we are asking here is which dimensions are stronger and thus which should be emphasized and focused on for the formation of identity and common life so that bad philosophy is avoided and the problems of rationality better addressed. Yes, the answer may shift between individuals, but we might do well to search for patterns. Another question, are whites and blacks who both work in nuclear engineering more similar than whites in investment banking compared with whites in construction? Is the divide between white-collar and blue-collar work greater than the divide between races? Personally, I would venture to say that the white college professor is more different from the white construction worker than the white construction worker is from a black construction worker. occupation radically forms the individual, though this is not to say race is informative or that white supremacy doesn't exist. And we certainly must be careful to treat white-collar and blue-collar like monoliths. There's a lot of diversity within white-collar and blue-collar work. But generally speaking, I would venture to say that the person who works manually is very different from the person who works at a desk, even if they both share the same race, sex, and gender. One's job and one's location are formative dimensions a person responds to every day, constantly and concretely, while one's race is more abstract and usually the minority responds to his or her race and responding to others responding to the minority's race, thus the social construct. You feel you are the only black person in the room when you are in a room with other people. You feel your race existentially because of others or because of the society that mistreats you due to your race. But if no one is around and you must unload a truck, you feel the boxes, the pain in your legs, and the weariness of your bones, regardless of who is there. Your job forms you regardless of the presence of others. This isn't to say that existential feelings based on race don't ever form people like work. There is arguably a connection between racism and healthcare, which is very concrete. And certainly the existential reflection due to race can be far more difficult than a day at the construction site. Rather, my point is that though people are formed by both, the black construction worker will probably be more like a white construction worker due to the consistency and concreteness of work. Please note that the devilness of racism can precisely be its lack of a clear and consistent reference point. And because occupation works on everyone more externally and similarly, while race tends to impact people more internally, existentially, and individually, which is arguably more difficult to deal with. I may be wrong about this, and again, it does not follow from my position that a given black construction worker won't be more like a given black lawyer than the black construction worker is his or her co-workers, is like his or her co-workers. My points are on generalities, not fates. But if I am correct, then Hume's common life is more robust than PD identity. If race, sex, and gender do not define people as strongly as do the dimensions of common life, then to replace Humean skepticism with PD identity would be to weaken identity and common life. Certainly it's better to have PD identity than nothing, for nothing would leave people defenseless and unable to stop neoliberalism from shaping them into a featureless consumer. But what Hume emphasized was more formative of individuals just seems truer to life. The black and white from Bedford do seem more similar than the white from Bedford alongside the white from Washington, though of course both whites benefit from social advantages and assumptions which do not favor minorities. In how people from Bedford live, talk, eat, celebrate, go about their business, they seem much more similar, despite differences of race, sex, and gender, and thus the dimensions of identity which Hume emphasized are worthy of that extra emphasis over the dimensions of PD identity. This is not to say the topics of PD identity are not worthy of study, practice, and corrective legislation. Again, everyone should read Blackness Visible by Charles Mills, but to say that Hume's common life is a strong and more robust foundation for practically completing rationality, and thus addressing rationality's incompleteness. That said, if common life doesn't engage in good philosophy, the banality of evil becomes likely and perhaps even probable, at least on micro levels. And arguably the greatest evils in history have resulted from the banality of evil. Considering this, if people cannot learn Hume's good philosophy, we might be better off shaped by the PD identity and foregoing common life. Unphilosophical common life may be worse than philosophical PD identity. A hanging question. When someone attends a black church service, is the person mostly engaging in a dimension of PD identity or Hume's common life? Both Hume and Derrida may have claimed the black church service for their project because it seems to be both, an expression of local and daily life that entails a dimension of race. Again, please note that Hume would not have said that race is irrelevant to identity formation, and certainly the rivers of common life and PD identity can merge here and divide there, blend for a time, and then separate. The problem is believing a person only needs Hume's common life or PD identity when one makes an enemy of the other and or when one tries to function as a foundation for rationality without proper understanding and respect for the other. Race does impact common life, and the Humean skeptic that does not appreciate this will not defer to a real common life, but an idea of common life, missing the very real element of race, and thus the common life will be incomplete and an abstraction. Used properly, PD identity could help the Humean fully grasp common life and is arguably necessary for the Humean project. At the same time, PD identity that has no place for common life is in fact hostile to it, will become a force of bad philosophy and fail to adequately address the incompleteness of rationality. The problem today is that it seems PD identity is being used in place of Hume's common life as opposed to being integrated into an understanding of common life. Postmodern deconstruction should become part of Hume's good philosophy, as opposed to try to be all that's needed for good philosophy, for then it becomes bad philosophy. Derrida and Hume can be merged, I think, but while Hume may stand alone better than Derrida as a good philosophy, Derrida without Hume does not as well avoid becoming a bad philosophy. The best is good. The best good philosophy may come from combining Derrida and Hume or Deleuze and Hume, but what that looks like particularly requires work to determine. And of course, Hegel could play a role as well. Lastly, on this line of thought, it's easier to say what a man shouldn't be, and much harder to say what a man should be. It's easier to say what white people shouldn't do versus say what they should do. It's not easy to determine what is whiteness, for any definition that is laid down will necessitate levels of exclusion. If there is no exclusion, the term is meaningless, for a term that means everything means nothing, and a term that means nothing is easily in service of bad philosophy, neoliberalism, or the zeitgeist of the day. But where there is exclusion, there can be oppression and injustice. How is the right balance struck? Not easily, and all exclusivity is hard to live with, but the exclusivity resulting from common life might be easier to accept than exclusivity from PD identity. This is because Hume's common life entails exclusivity, but the exclusivity comes from outside forces, history, geography, culture. No one living today sits down and decides the exclusions of a people's common life. Yes, people can decide the meaning of tradition, geography, and culture, and what dimensions of those should be emphasized, but even these leaders can feel like they are responding to something bigger than themselves and not entirely in their control. The exclusivity feels less a result of arbitrary choice and necessary adaptation, and what feels chosen is necessarily what we can feel more existential about, because it can be changed, and we are responsible for the resulting exclusivity and possible pain. See The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. More existentially difficult, the exclusivity of PD identity requires people today to set the limits, which means someone must have the final say, and why should that person have the power and not someone else? A host of questions arise, all of which will inhibit the establishment of exclusivities. Exclusivity resulting from common life can feel more like something people need to humble themselves in light of, as opposed to choose and form, something requiring adaptation versus designing. Certainly, all common lives are formed by human choices and designs in the historic past, but over decades, the common lives can rightly or wrongly feel less arbitrary and more solid and part of the land, making them easier to live with, which can be problematic when used in service of the banality of evil, race, gender, and sex, precisely in creating weaker givens are less likely to give rise to Arden's nightmare. Yes, there are times when common life and givens should be changed instead of adapted to, but this returns us to the question of how we can correct givens without destroying them, and if PD identity or Humean skepticism is better at this balance, and if, say, PD identity, though not as robust as common life, is still robust enough for humanity to get by with the additional advantage of being less prone to the banality of evil. Again, perhaps the best would be a combination of Hume and Derrida. This has been Deconstructing Common Life by O.G. Rose. For more, please visit Facebook, Instagram, Anchor, Twitter, and so forth, and thank you for your time.